Hello guys.
Inherited from my grandparents, their large and precious house was unfairly inherited by my brother, who was a loser. My whole life, I thought my brother Eric and I were equals in the family, no favoritism, no drama. Turns out, I was spectacularly wrong. Last week, we had the will reading for my grandparents. My grandpa passed away 6 months ago, and grandma followed recently. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some sentimental stuff, but what I found out hit me like a truck. My whole family gathered in this small, stuffy lawyer's office, me, my brother Eric, 24M, and my parents, Carl and Linda. Everyone was a little somber, but Eric was oddly smug. I chalked it up to him being Eric, he's always been kind of entitled. The lawyer starts going over the will, and it's all pretty standard at first, a few mementos, charitable donations, etc. Then comes the big one, the house. It's a gorgeous property with acres of land, a dream for anyone starting out. My ears perked up. I mean, it's not like I was counting on it, but hey, it's a family home, right? And grandma always said she wanted it to stay in the family. And then, the house and property will be left to Eric, the lawyer announced. I blinked. What? My parents nodded along like this was totally normal. Eric was grinning ear to ear. Meanwhile, I sat there like an idiot, trying to process. Not only did I not get the house, but there was nothing left for me at all. Zilch. When I finally found my voice, I asked, why does Eric get the house? The lawyer hesitated, then explained the reasoning. Your grandmother believed Eric needed the house more because he's still single and hasn't had the opportunity to settle down. That's when it hit me, this wasn't about need. It was about Eric being a screw-up. He flunked out of college, lives at home, and parties like he's trying to audition for a reality show. Meanwhile, I've been busting my butt to build a stable life. But apparently, I don't need a house because I'm responsible. It felt like a punch to the gut. I don't know if it was Eric's smug face or my parents' nonchalance, but something snapped in me. I decided right then that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After the will reading, I couldn't just let it go. Something about the way Eric smirked at me as we left the lawyer's office told me there was more to this than just grandma's kindness. So, I decided to dig deeper. Later that evening, I confronted my parents. Why does Eric get the house? Did grandma really think he deserved it more? My mom sighed like I was a child asking why the sky is blue. You've always been the independent one, Alex. You don't need the house the way Eric does. He's struggling. Struggling? Are you kidding me? Eric was struggling because he spent more time at bars than in class, failed out of college, and now spent his days bumming around doing who knows what. But sure, let's reward that behavior. I pushed back. So, you're saying I'm punished for being responsible? How does that make sense? My dad jumped in, his tone dismissive. Your grandmother made her decision, Alex. She wanted to help Eric get back on his feet. You've got a good job, your own place, you don't need the house. I was floored. It wasn't even about fairness, it was about enabling Eric, as usual. And here's the kicker, apparently, my parents had helped grandma draft the will. They pushed for this because they wanted to give Eric a chance. A chance? He's had a million chances. And each one of them ended with him blowing it and everyone else cleaning up his mess. When I turned to leave, Eric, who had been eavesdropping from the next room, waltzed in, looking all self-satisfied. Don't worry, Alex. I'll make sure to invite you over for barbecues. You know, once I get settled. I wanted to punch him. But instead, I took a deep breath and walked out. Fine. If they thought Eric deserved the house, they'd regret it soon enough. I was done playing nice. This wasn't over. I just needed a plan. After that humiliating exchange, I went home and spent the night stewing. How could they just write me off like that? The more I thought about it, the more I realized something didn't add up. Grandma was many things, but she wasn't a pushover. For her to leave everything to Eric, someone had to have influenced her. The next day, I called up her best friend, Mrs. Peterson. She was practically family, having lived next door to my grandparents for decades. If anyone knew what was really going on, it'd be her. She didn't disappoint. Oh, Alex, your grandmother didn't want Eric to have the house at first, she revealed. She mentioned to me that she thought it'd be better for you. But your parents had a long talk with her, saying Eric needed a break, and they convinced her to change her mind. My stomach dropped. So, my parents did orchestrate this. I could feel my blood boiling, but Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished. You know, Alex, she added hesitantly, your grandfather had some concerns before he passed. He thought Eric would squander the property and wasn't sure he'd even keep it in the family. This changed everything. If Grandpa didn't want Eric to have the house, why didn't Grandma honor that? And what were these concerns she mentioned? Mrs. Peterson promised to dig up some old letters my grandparents had exchanged, thinking they might shed light on what my grandpa had really wanted. In the meantime, I knew I had to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't the only thing my family had been keeping from me. And if Eric thought he could just waltz into his new mansion, he had another thing coming. A few days later, Mrs. Peterson called with an urgency that sent me straight to her house. She handed me an old envelope filled with letters from my grandfather, written in his last months. She explained that my grandmother had shared them, torn about what to do. The weight of her words made my hands tremble as I unfolded the first letter. In one of the notes, my grandfather expressed his doubts about Eric's ability to handle the responsibility of the house. He feared Eric's immaturity and noted that he showed no signs of growing up, while he admired my work ethic. He mentioned that my mother had argued that I didn't need help and pushed for Eric to inherit the property instead. The injustice stung deeper with every word. The next letter revealed my grandfather's growing despair. He worried that Eric would squander the house within a year, either selling it or letting it fall into ruin. He admitted that he tried to reason with my mother but met nothing but resistance. His words painted a clear picture. This wasn't just about favoritism, it was a deliberate choice to enable Eric, one my grandfather strongly opposed. By the time I finished reading, my anger was matched only by a sense of responsibility. My grandparents had worked so hard to build something lasting, and now it was on the verge of being thrown away. My parents hadn't just wronged me, they'd ignored my grandfather's wishes entirely. As I left Mrs. Peterson's house, her parting words echoed in my mind. My grandfather had believed in me, trusted me to make the right decisions. It wasn't just about reclaiming what I was owed, it was about preserving his legacy. For Eric and my parents, this was just the beginning. Armed with my grandfather's letters, I decided it was time to confront my parents. I couldn't let them rewrite the family's history or brush aside the truth. I showed up unannounced at their house, the letters tucked into my jacket like ammunition. When I walked in, my mother greeted me with her usual dismissive tone, asking if I was there to make peace about the will. I didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, I laid the letters on the kitchen table and told them to read. My father's face darkened as he skimmed the pages, and my mother's expression flickered between irritation and guilt. They didn't deny the contents, they didn't even try. My mother simply said, "Your grandfather was old and stubborn. He didn't understand that Eric needed a fresh start." A fresh start? I pointed out that Eric had been given countless fresh starts, tuition paid, bills covered, even a failed attempt at starting a business, all funded by the family. And now, this house was just another handout, one he clearly didn't deserve. Their silence spoke volumes. My father finally broke the tension, muttering that they'd only wanted to give Eric a chance to succeed. "And what about me?" I snapped. "Does working hard and being responsible mean I get nothing?" The more I spoke, the more I realized this wasn't just about the house, it was about a lifetime of being the afterthought. My success had been used as an excuse to ignore me, while Eric's failures had been endlessly rewarded. And now, they'd manipulated my grandmother into going against my grandfather's wishes. "I'm not letting this go," I said firmly. "You might have written me off, but Grandpa didn't. And I'm going to make sure his wishes are honored, whether you like it or not." As I left, I could feel their unease following me out the door. They weren't used to me standing up for myself, and it showed. But this wasn't about keeping the peace anymore. It was about justice. Leaving my parents' house felt like a small victory, but I knew the real challenge lay ahead. It wasn't enough to confront them, I needed to back up my claims with something undeniable. If this turned into a legal battle, I couldn't just rely on the letters, I needed concrete proof that my grandparents' intentions had been manipulated. I started by visiting the lawyer who had handled my grandparents' will. He wasn't exactly eager to share information, citing client confidentiality, but I pressed on. I mentioned the letters and explained how my grandfather's wishes had been ignored. That seemed to crack his professional exterior. "The will was revised about 6 months before your grandfather passed," he finally admitted. "Originally, the house was intended for you, but your grandmother changed it after a conversation with your parents." Hearing it laid out so plainly still hit me like a gut punch. My parents had successfully swayed her to rewrite history. But why? Was it guilt? Blind favoritism? Or something worse? Before I left, I asked if there was any documentation of the earlier version of the will. The lawyer hesitated but eventually agreed to check his records. It would take a few days, but it was something. In the meantime, I started looking into Eric's financial situation. It wasn't hard, he'd been careless for years, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts and failed ventures. A quick search online revealed that he was already bragging about the house on social media. His posts were filled with plans for renovations, though knowing Eric, that likely meant tearing down walls to host parties, not preserving the property. I also learned that he'd been approached by a local developer interested in buying the land. That made my blood boil. My grandparents had worked their whole lives to keep that house in the family, and Eric was ready to sell it off for cash the first chance he got. It was all the confirmation I needed. My parents' misguided generosity wasn't just enabling Eric, it was destroying my grandparents' legacy. I had no choice but to act, and this time, I wasn't going to hold back. With everything I'd uncovered, the letters, the will revisions, and Eric's reckless behavior, I knew it was time to escalate. Waiting for the lawyer's confirmation on the earlier version of the will, I decided to take a more direct approach with Eric. If anyone could accidentally reveal something damaging, it was him. I called him up and casually suggested grabbing a drink to celebrate his new home. He was immediately on board, no doubt thrilled at the idea of rubbing it in my face. At the bar, Eric wasted no time boasting about the house. "Man, this place is going to be sick once I fix it up. Maybe even sell it, you know. Could be sitting on a goldmine." He laughed, as if he'd earned it. Feigning interest, I pressed him on how he managed to score such a deal. "Grandma must have really loved you, huh?" Eric shrugged, clearly drunk on both alcohol and his own self-importance. "Yeah, well, Mom and Dad helped her see the bigger picture. They said you didn't need it since you're already set for life. Guess being the screw-up finally paid off." I clenched my jaw but kept my cool. He'd just admitted that my parents had actively lobbied for him, but I needed more. "And what about Grandpa? Wasn't he against it?" Eric hesitated, then waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, yeah, he had some old-school ideas about responsibility and all that crap. But once he was gone, Grandma didn't have much choice." That was it, the confirmation I needed. Eric, in his arrogance, had just admitted that my parents waited until my grandfather passed to push their agenda. It wasn't just favoritism, it was calculated. The next day, the lawyer called. He'd found the original will, and as expected, the house had been intended for me. With this new evidence and Eric's careless admission, I finally had enough to make a case. I wasn't just fighting for the house anymore, I was standing up for everything my grandparents believed in. And if my family thought they could sweep this under the rug, they were about to find out how wrong they were. With the original will in hand and Eric's drunken confession fresh in my mind, I contacted a family lawyer to discuss my options. I was done playing games. This wasn't just about correcting an injustice, it was about holding my family accountable for years of manipulation. The lawyer, Miss Carter, was thorough and didn't sugarcoat anything. "It's not uncommon for wills to be revised under family pressure," she explained. "But the fact that we have the original document and evidence of undue influence could make this a strong case." Undue influence. Hearing her say it made everything click. My parents hadn't just convinced Grandma to rewrite the will, they'd exploited her grief after losing Grandpa. And Eric? He was too oblivious to realize he was a pawn in their scheme. We filed a formal contest to the will, citing my grandfather's letters, the lawyer's testimony, and the original document as evidence. Once the paperwork was submitted, I let my parents and Eric know. When I broke the news, my mother was livid. "How dare you drag our family through the courts," she snapped. "Your grandmother was clear about her wishes." I stood firm. "No, she wasn't. She was manipulated by you, and I have the proof to back it up." Eric, predictably, tried to play the victim. "So what, you're just going to take the house away from me? After I've already started making plans? You mean plans to sell it?" I shot back. His silence said it all. My father, always the peacemaker, tried to guilt me. "We're a family, Alex. Is this really worth tearing us apart?" "Family didn't seem to matter when you wrote me off," I replied. "This isn't about the house, it's about honoring Grandpa's wishes. If you wanted to keep the family intact, maybe you shouldn't have played favorites." The room fell silent. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They knew I wasn't backing down. As the legal contest gained traction, the fragile facade of family unity shattered completely. My parents, who had once dismissed me so easily, now scrambled to defend themselves. Eric, predictably, went into full meltdown mode. His social media posts went from bragging about his future renovations to dramatic, self-pitying rants. "Some people just can't stand to see others happy," and "It's sad when family turns against you for no reason." It was laughable. Eric had no clue how to play the victim convincingly, but the posts weren't harmless, they were fueling tensions. Friends and extended family began chiming in, and before I knew it, I was getting texts and calls from relatives asking why I was stirring up trouble. To avoid further chaos, I decided to confront the matter head-on at a family meeting my mother had hastily arranged. She claimed it was an opportunity to resolve things peacefully, but I wasn't naive. I knew this was her way of regaining control. When I arrived at my parents' house, the tension in the air was palpable. My mother had prepared tea and cookies, a half-hearted attempt to set a welcoming tone. Eric lounged on the couch with a scowl, arms crossed like a petulant child. My father sat at the kitchen table, staring into his mug, already looking defeated. "We're here to talk, not to fight," my mother started, her voice tight with strain. Alex, we need to find a way to move past this unpleasantness. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. Unpleasantness? You mean ignoring Grandpa's wishes, manipulating Grandma, and giving Eric something he's done nothing to earn? That's a little more than unpleasant, don't you think? Eric scoffed. Oh, here we go. You always have to make everything about you, don't you? I shot him a glare. You're kidding, right? You're the one who's been handed everything your entire life and still manages to screw it up. Do you even know what it means to earn something? Alex, that's enough, my mother snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. Eric has had a hard time. He struggled, and we just wanted to give him a chance to get back on his feet. Struggled? I stood up, unable to keep my composure any longer. You mean blowing through tuition money, flunking out of college, partying every night, and treating the family like his personal ATM? If that's struggling, then what do you call the years I spent working my way through school, paying my own bills, and never asking you for a dime? My father finally spoke, his voice heavy. We didn't mean to hurt you, Alex. We just thought Eric needed this more than you did. You've always been independent. We thought you'd understand. Understand? That was rich. No, Dad, I don't understand. I don't understand why being responsible is treated like a punishment in this family. Grandpa trusted me to take care of that house because he knew I wouldn't let him down. And you, both of you, decided that didn't matter. Eric jumped in, his tone smug. Oh, so now you're the hero, huh? The savior of Grandpa's legacy? Get over yourself, Alex. It's just a house. It's not just a house, Eric, I said through gritted teeth. It's the place Grandma and Grandpa built together. It's where they spent their lives. And if you think I'm going to let you sell it to some developer or trash it with your renovations, you're delusional. The room went silent, the weight of my words sinking in. My mother opened her mouth as if to speak but then stopped, her face pale. My father looked away, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time, it seemed like they were beginning to realize just how badly they'd miscalculated. I turned to leave, but before I did, I said one final thing. You might think I'm doing this out of spite, but I'm not. I'm doing it because Grandpa trusted me. He believed in me, even when you didn't. And I'll fight for that trust, no matter what it takes. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, vindication, and a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally start to understand. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. The weeks that followed were intense. The legal contest moved forward, and the tension between my family and me reached its breaking point. Eric tried to stall, claiming he needed more time to sort things out, but it was clear he was panicking. Meanwhile, my parents' calls became less frequent, replaced by vague messages pleading with me to think about the family. I wasn't backing down. The final hearing came faster than I expected. Ms. Carter had meticulously prepared our case, weaving together my grandfather's letters, the original will, and testimony from the estate's lawyer. The judge listened carefully as we laid out the evidence of undue influence, and Eric's irresponsible behavior didn't help his cause. Eric, predictably, tried to spin the situation. He painted himself as a victim of my vindictive actions, claiming I was trying to take everything from him out of jealousy. It was pathetic and, frankly, insulting. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my words simple but heartfelt. I explained how much my grandparents' home meant, not just to me, but to our family's history. I talked about my grandfather's trust in me, his belief that I'd honor what they built. And I didn't hold back when I described how my parents' actions had betrayed his wishes. By the time I finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Eric had stopped his fidgeting. The judge ruled in my favor. The house, along with the surrounding property, was to be transferred to me. The decision wasn't just a victory, it was a validation of everything I'd fought for. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. But the fallout wasn't over. Eric refused to speak to me, storming off in a huff. My parents, too, were cold and distant. I didn't care anymore. If they couldn't see the harm they'd caused, that was on them. When I finally stepped into the house for the first time as its rightful owner, it felt bittersweet. I could almost hear my grandparents' voices, their laughter echoing through the halls. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a way to honor them and everything they'd stood for. Since then, I've started restoring the house, bringing it back to the warm, welcoming place it once was. I don't know if my family will ever fully repair the damage, but I've learned something important through all of this. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by trust, respect, and shared values. And those are things I refuse to compromise on ever again.
See you later.